On February 24th, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30s named Arturo Novoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch, so she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything, even meaningless stuff like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together. And that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away, they just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship ran deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself without telling anyone where she was. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck. And over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about. Until finally, Arturo said, maybe he should just leave for good. And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change. She could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change, but Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now, she could start putting her degree and her talents to work, and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, got undressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22, 2017, so 4 months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk, and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? and Debbie repeated herself and said again it had been 4 months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons report, if anything, too soon, like before they really needed to, not 4 months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long. But if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager. And as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now, they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby, and that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew 4 months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details like Shannon's favorite color was pink, and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months, and also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they'd called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men, other than Arturo, that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scarata. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scarata all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John, and it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown, trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scarata walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her. And John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried, he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment over the past few months. John had staked out the place, looking for Shannon or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio, so there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So, in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her coworkers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits or the deceased, and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something: a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here. And somehow, this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said. And both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is, until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying. Because there, laying on the ground, were saw blades, a rope, and a pink sock. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink, and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So, the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else, purposefully avoiding her friends and family. Or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction. And while he didn't want to rule anything out, he doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making, and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer and walked over to a white, rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer, and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so now, with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up, and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open, and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside of that bucket. And the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this. Because in the bucket, Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer, and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost. Then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off, and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, and this had become a homicide investigation, news of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, had returned. John had heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier. And at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff in a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and a crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes. And they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it. Because of all the possible things he could have found, this was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out, because Andrew was a total psychopath. A guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room. And Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything, one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, yep, the bracelet was Shannon's, and he was trying to burn it. And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation. Because he was now able to connect Anthony, aka Tony G, the man who'd brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend, Anthony, had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling this story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower, and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. and for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. The bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through. So they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor, they took her purse, and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help. And later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party, where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire, and they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. Killer picked it up, and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid, and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags and a bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings. And his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names, were both aliases. Anthony, aka Tony G, was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through. So after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias, Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him, which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad, and they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something. because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony. The photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years.
In early 1945, during World War II, the British decided they wanted to take back Ramree Island from the Japanese. Ramree Island is a fairly large, totally flat island off the coast of Burma that was a great staging location to fly air campaigns onto the mainland. So it was a great air base. And the British had actually owned this island, but the Japanese had taken it back from them in 1942. And so here they are in 1945 looking to take it back. So on January 21st, 1945, British and Indian infantry stormed the beaches of Ramree to try to take it back. As soon as they land, they have all this naval artillery support just bombing the crap out of this airbase. It was just a matter of time before they overwhelmed the remaining Japanese. But the Japanese do not want to surrender, and instead they give up the airbase that they were on, so the British take that back, and the remaining 1,000 Japanese soldiers started retreating to the opposite end of the island, to where there was a much larger battalion of Japanese soldiers that they could meet up with. But the only issue with this particular retreat was they would have to go through 10 miles of mangrove swamp where there's poisonous spiders and insects and deep mud, making it almost impossible to move. But they're determined and they head off into the swamp. But what the Japanese were not ready for is what Ramree Island is famous for. A creature that makes poisonous snakes and spiders and insects look like child's play. And they were walking directly into its den. The British troops decided we're not going to go chasing them into the swamp. And instead what they did is they set up boats, blocking positions outside of the swamp. If any of the Japanese tried to escape, they would be there waiting. And so the only way the Japanese could get out of there would be to go to the absolute other end, 10 miles away, where their Japanese counterparts were. So that night, as the British are just kind of hanging out in their boats staring at the swamp, they start hearing screams coming from inside of this swamp, and it's Japanese soldiers. Then you hear gunfire, and then silence. And then it would start all over again, all over this huge swamp. It was just screams, gunfire, silence, screams, gunfire, silence. And the British are watching this like, do we have troops in there? What's going on in there? What was going on in there is defined by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest massacre of humans caused by animals. And not just any animal, saltwater crocodiles. These massive man-eating crocodiles can weigh up to 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. They can grow to be 7 meters in length or about 23 feet in length. And National Geographic has labeled these crocodiles as the most likely to eat a human of all animals. And Ramree Island has the largest population of saltwater crocodiles in the world, and they all lived inside of the swamp that the Japanese had gone into. A lot of them were bleeding from the battle they were in, and so they were literally alerting hundreds of saltwater crocodiles to their location. Saltwater crocodiles are notorious night hunters. So what probably happened is the Japanese got inside of this mangrove. The crocodiles were immediately aware of their presence, but they waited until nighttime before they started having a feeding frenzy. And over the course of the night, a number of Japanese soldiers had jumped out the sides of the swamp, exposing themselves to the British. And so about 20 of them were captured, and they said that they were completely surrounded by these crocodiles, that everywhere you looked, there were growling, huge crocodiles eating one person, and as soon as they were done, they would just charge after you and eat you. And at the end of their retreat, when the Japanese did get to the other side of the swamp, only 500 of the 1,000 made it out the other side. And so to this day, people stay far away from Ramree Island because there are so many of these man-eating saltwater crocodiles that have no issue ripping you to shreds.
Our next story is called Set Z.
On December 6, 1941, 20-year-old U.S. Navy sailor Clifford Olds met up with a couple of his shipmates at the Monkey Bar for a night out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next morning, just before 8 a.m., Cliff was back on board his ship, the USS West Virginia. He was starting his workday when the Japanese launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Cliff's ship was a prime target and was quickly hit with 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, hundreds of people are dying on board, and very quickly his ship is starting to sink. On board a Navy ship, there's all these different conditions the ship is set to depending on what you're doing, whether you're at war or you're just docked in peacetime, and all of these different conditions have very specific instructions. And one of those conditions is Condition Z. Better known as Setting Z, if the captain of a ship calls this out over the loudspeakers, every single hatch inside of that ship is shut and locked. If your ship is sinking and you say Set Z, you are sealing all of those compartments so no more water can flow into them, and you can maintain a little bit of buoyancy so you don't sink quite as fast. But if you set Z as your ship is sinking, especially if you're getting attacked and there's all these holes in your ship, there's a good chance when you seal those hatches, you're going to be sealing people inside of these rooms and they will not be able to get out again. So when that call comes out over the loudspeakers, Set Z, everybody knows to get the heck out of their compartments so that they do not get trapped inside of one of those rooms. On Cliff's ship, Set Z was called over the loudspeakers, and Cliff, along with Ron Endicott, who was 18, and Buddy Costin, who was 21, were at the bottom of the ship in the freshwater pump room, and when someone came by and shut and sealed their room, they did not see them in there. And so probably the 3 of them ran to the door and were banging on it and trying to get someone's attention, but in the chaos of the moment, that person on the other side of the door that could have opened it up again was now gone. Even though the Set Z procedure did prevent water from going into certain cabins on the West Virginia, it still would sink to the bottom of the ocean along with 17 other ships. The next day, there was a whole bunch of Marines that were on the dock right next to where the wreckage of the West Virginia was underneath the water. And as they're standing on the dock, they start hearing a banging sound. And at first they think it's probably just a salvage team or it's some strap clanging against the side of one of these ships. But they started to notice the tapping sounds started to sound like intentional rhythms that a human might make. And it dawned on them that someone is trying to get our attention underwater. There are people trapped in the West Virginia. But when the Marines ran to their superiors and told them there are people trapped inside of the ship, we have to get them out, they broke the horrible news that there's nothing they could do for them. If they went down and began trying to cut a hole in the side of the ship so they could swim out, as soon as there's even a tiny little hole on the side of that ship, there's so much pressure that it would rush inside and fill that space almost immediately, and they wouldn't be able to cut a hole big enough, fast enough, and so cutting into the ship is going to kill them. Also, just lighting that torch presents a unique problem because there's so many chemicals in the water from all of the attacks that happened the day before, we run the risk of lighting a fire or lighting off an explosion that could take even more life. And because they were still months away from being able to raise the ship out of the water, which would save them, the decision was made that we're going to have to let them die. And so for the next 16 days, Marines and sailors were put on guard duty right next to the wreckage of the USS West Virginia, and they would listen to the tapping as they desperately tried to tell people, come down here, save us, we're alive, we're not going anywhere, please help us. And the Marines and sailors were so distressed about this. It was so horrible to listen to. They would cry and cover their ears because they wanted to save them. They're so close, but they're so far away. Finally, on Christmas Eve, the banging stopped. 6 months later, they were finally able to raise the West Virginia out of the water. And as crews were going through all the different compartments and removing bodies, they got to the freshwater pump room where Cliff, Ron, and Buddy had been. They open it up and they find 3 bodies, and they realize right away the torture these poor guys had gone through. Inside this airtight section was this locker full of food rations. They're also in the freshwater pump room, And so they just opened up the tank and they had all the fresh water they needed. But what they didn't have enough of was air. And so for 16 days, sitting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, knowing they're not going to get out of here, they slowly suffocated. And we know they were alive for those 16 days because they had a calendar where they were marking off each of the days they were down there in red pen. This story was so distressing, the Navy decided not to share the information about what happened to those three to their families. It wasn't until years later the truth came out, but even today, on memorials and monuments commemorating what happened at Pearl Harbor, they are listed, Cliff, Buddy, and Ron are listed as killed in action on December 7th.
On the morning of August 16, 1942, a woman named Ida Ruby was riding her horse on a dirt path right near a beach just south of San Francisco, California. Now, during the week, Ida was a telephone operator, but it was a Sunday, so she had time off, and the way she liked to spend her time off was by riding her horse along the coastline and, looking out at the beautiful water and taking in the nature and all these unbelievable cliffs that went down to the water. I mean, this was a beautiful area, and every time Ida would go out and do this little ride around, she would bring binoculars with her. And so anytime she saw something of interest, she would stop and, use her binoculars to see what it was, like animals or things out over the water. And on this particular Sunday, Ida turned a corner, and as soon as she did, something caught her attention off to her right, out over the water. And so she stopped her horse and she turned, and she looked out, and the sea was very calm, and she could see way out just past the horizon was what looked like this black thing kind of hovering over the water. And instead of raising her binoculars right away, she just kind of squinted and looked off in the direction, and she quickly realized what it was. It was a blimp. Now, today, when we hear the word blimp, we very likely think of the Goodyear blimp that kind of sits over sporting events, with the big Goodyear logo stamped on the side of it. It's basically a big balloon with a gondola that sits underneath it for the person who's driving it and passengers. And that's actually exactly what Ida was seeing, a big oversized balloon with a gondola underneath it. But this was not a Goodyear blimp, it was a military blimp. Because this was 1942, right in the middle of World War II. And 9 months earlier, the United States had joined World War II after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And ever since then, Japanese submarines had been lurking off the coast of California, kind of all across the West Coast, out in the Pacific Ocean, and occasionally they would send torpedoes out and bomb the US mainland. And so the United States responded to this by launching this fleet of blimps that basically were able to get really low to the water, that could move really slowly, and they would basically fly all along the Pacific coastline looking for Japanese submarines. They could literally go down, and from their gondola, they could look down and actually see submarines and mark them for bombing runs or, scare them off. And so Ida, like anybody else who was living on the west coast of the United States at the time, was aware that there were blimps out over the ocean, but it was still a fairly uncommon sight. And so because of that, Ida was sort of intrigued, and so she raised her binoculars, and she focused on this blimp, and she would see something that was so strange that even 80 years later, nobody can fully explain it. But to really understand why what she saw was so weird, we need to back up about 5 hours on the same day to about 6 a.m. at a military base just north of where Ida was seeing this blimp. And so at 6 a.m. at this military base, that particular blimp that Ida would later see was at this military base on the ground, and some Navy pilots and mechanics were preparing the blimp for a routine mission out over the San Francisco Bay to look for Japanese submarines. The intended path this blimp was going to take on this day was it would leave the base, and the pilot would take it over the famous Golden Gate Bridge, and then it would travel 28 miles to the west to the Farallon Islands. And then from there, the pilot would go 20 miles to the north to a peninsula called Point Reyes, and then from there, the pilot would head south along the coastline all the way back to base. This whole mission profile was scheduled to take about 4 hours. The pilots for this mission were going to be a 27-year-old Navy lieutenant named Ernest Cody and a 34-year-old officer named Charles Adams. And both of them were very experienced blimp pilots. They had done missions like this many times before. This was going to be a very routine mission for them. And then also, in addition to those two pilots, there would be a Navy mechanic who would join the two pilots in case there was any malfunctions with the blimp during the mission. And so everything was going to plan with this blimp that morning. There was nothing unusual about this mission,
But right as the two pilots and the mechanic were literally getting inside of the gondola to begin this mission, Lieutenant Cody looked down at the control panel inside the blimp, and he noticed the blimp was way heavier than it should have been. Now, you have to understand that the level of rigor that went into preparing these blimps for flight was really intense. I mean, they were weighing every little thing that was put inside of this blimp because it was a really important part of flying these blimps, understanding how heavy it was. And so for this to be too heavy just made no sense. And so at first, Cody and Adams began tapping on the control panel, thinking maybe the panel itself was malfunctioning, and if they hit it hard enough, the little ticker would go back to a normal weight. But despite, hitting the panel, it still showed it was too heavy. And so they flagged over the mechanic who was going to be joining them on the flight anyways. And the mechanic looked and kind of thought for a second and then realized, that day it had been very foggy. And so it was totally possible that all this extra moisture in the air had stuck to the surface of the balloon. And so collectively that had added quite a bit of weight. I mean, this is a massive balloon, a lot of surface area, a lot of water. Now, this was not some crisis. At worst, this was an inconvenience. Basically, they had to wait until this moisture kind of burned off once the sun came out, and then they could fly the blimp. But Cody and Adams, they just didn't feel like waiting. This mission was so routine, so simple, they'd done it so many times. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams decided that the easiest and fastest solution to this problem was simply to tell the mechanic who was going to come with them on this mission to not come with them. Without his weight inside of the gondola, even with this extra moisture in the blimp, it wouldn't matter. The blimp would still be light enough to fly with just the two pilots on board. The mechanic didn't care, so he hopped off, and then Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams took their seats inside the gondola, and sure enough, when they looked at the control panel, the blimp was ready to go. It was light enough. And so Lieutenant Cody fired up the blimp's engines, and just after 6 a.m. that morning, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams lifted off the ground and began their routine mission. About an hour and a half later, at 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed back to air control, saying that so far the patrol had been totally routine, everything was going smoothly, they hadn't seen any Japanese submarines or anything out of the ordinary. And also, Lieutenant Cody said they were positioned just east of the Farallon Islands, which meant they were exactly on course, and really everything did seem to be going exactly to plan. But 4 minutes later, Lieutenant Cody radioed back again to air control, and he said they had just spotted an oil slick down on the water. So basically, picture from their perspective, they saw that gleaming oil sitting on top of the ocean. And so at the time, this often signaled that below the surface of the water, under this oil slick, was a submarine. So this is like a telltale sign that the Japanese could be right here. So Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams told air control that they were going to descend in the blimp down to the water and fully investigate this oil slick, and then they'd report back. This last transmission happened at 7:50 a.m. A few minutes later, a fishing boat named the Daisy Gray was gliding slowly through the water just east of the Farallon Islands, when all of a sudden the captain, who's looking straight ahead, he turned the boat and he happened to see straight ahead of him this massive blimp, the same blimp Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were in, descending very quickly through the clouds down towards the water. And remember, this was a pretty cloudy day, and so really this blimp kind of came out of nowhere, and this fishing boat captain was very aware that anytime blimps were out over the water, that was because they were looking for enemy submarines. And this captain realized he was heading right now straight in the direction of wherever this blimp was descending towards. And so the captain looked out ahead, and he saw that big oil slick on top of the water, maybe 100 yards away from him, and so he put it together that, oh my gosh, this blimp is going to that slick. That means there's an enemy submarine basically right there. And so in a panic, the fishing boat captain called to his crew to pull in the fishing nets, and he turned the wheel as fast as he could, and he hit the accelerator, doing everything he could to get away from this blimp. Because he knew that typically what happened when a blimp came down and actually found a submarine is they sometimes dropped bombs on the submarine. I mean, this is warfare. And so the fishing boat captain is getting away as fast as he can, and as soon as he's turned around, he looked back, and he saw the blimp was now about 30 feet over the water, and someone inside the gondola was now leaning out over the side, and they dropped two things directly into the water, into that oil slick. And then seconds later, these huge plumes of smoke were coming out of the water. The person had just dropped some flares, basically marking where this submarine was. And so now the captain knew, okay, it's a submarine, and the next thing is very likely going to be a bomb, like a depth charge is going to be dropped right there. And so again, the captain's just speeding his way as fast as he can, hoping that if they do drop a bomb, it doesn't affect him and his crew. And so after making it another couple 100 feet away from this blimp, the captain again turned around, expecting to see this blimp still hovering where it was, because again, they had just dropped flares. They're preparing to do something major right there. But now, when the captain turned around, he saw the blimp was no longer hanging out over the water. The blimp was now rocketing back up into the clouds, like as fast as it possibly could, and before long, the blimp was gone. It disappeared into the clouds. And there had been no bomb dropped. I mean, nothing really happened beyond marking the water, so it was like, what's going on with this blimp? Meanwhile, back at air control, the last thing they heard from Lieutenant Cody was, hey, we see this oil slick down below, we're going to investigate, and we'll radio back when we're done. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, they had clearly descended down to the water because that fishing boat saw it happen, but then after they rocketed back up to the clouds for some reason, they never radioed back to air control. And so air control is waiting and waiting, they're not hearing back from Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams, and finally, they began hailing the two pilots to say, hey, what's going on? You said you were going to investigate, what'd you find? What happened? But they could not get in touch with Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And so eventually, after enough time had passed and they still had not heard from these pilots, air control sent 2 seaplanes out to that area east of the Farallon Islands to find the blimp and make sure the blimp was okay. But when the seaplanes got out there, they couldn't find the blimp anywhere. I mean, they flew all over the place doing wider and wider circuits. There was no sign of the blimp. And when they looked down at the water in the same area where Lieutenant Cody had called out that slick and where that fishing boat had also seen the slick, well, the slick was gone or the seaplanes just couldn't see the oil slick. But the seaplanes stayed on station in that area near the Farallon Islands for another 2 hours, just flying all over the place, kind of hoping to eventually see this blimp. And eventually they would. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, one of the seaplanes spotted the blimp way, way high in the sky, like way higher than any blimp would ever go. It is dangerously high, and it was way off course. But when these 2 seaplane pilots began flying towards the blimp to get eyes on the pilots inside of this blimp, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, well, when they got close enough, the blimp just began rapidly descending, like it was trying to avoid being seen by these seaplanes. And in fact, the blimp descended so quickly that it dropped below the cloud cover, and the seaplanes, they couldn't move that quickly. They had to do a big track to turn back around and try to go lower again. But once they got below the clouds to find this blimp, the blimp was gone. It basically had vanished. And so the seaplane pilots called back to air control and they're like, I don't know what's going on with this blimp, but it's way off course. It was way up in the sky. Now it's somewhere down below, but we can't find it. We got to get in touch with Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. There's obviously something wrong. But air control would try over and over again to get in touch with these pilots, but neither Cody nor Adams ever responded. They had just gone totally radio silent. And at the same time this chaos with this blimp is happening, Ida Ruby, the woman at the beginning of the story, was riding her horse on that dirt path near the beach just south of San Francisco, and she looked out over the water and she saw that blimp. And so Ida Ruby, she stops, she raises her binoculars, and she looks at this blimp. And after she focuses her binoculars, she realizes there's obviously something wrong with this blimp. The actual balloon portion of the blimp, which said Navy on it, had collapsed so much in the middle that you couldn't even read the word Navy. It was all crumpled together because, again, the balloon is like deflated. And also she saw that this blimp appeared to just be kind of listing as if the wind was blowing it and it was not being directed by the pilots inside. And this blimp appeared to be getting blown directly towards Ida. And so she lowered her binoculars and she looked out with her naked eye, and sure enough, this crumpled up blimp that was still afloat but clearly was not doing too well was getting closer and closer and closer to her. And as it was getting lower and lower to the ground, and she's starting to worry it's going to smash into her. But right as this blimp was about to pass basically right over her head, she raised her binoculars one more time and she got a clear look inside of the gondola where Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams would have been.
Now, Ida Ruby has no idea who's supposed to be inside of this blimp and who isn't, or even what they're doing, but she definitely recalled exactly what she saw inside of that gondola, and that's the thing that has troubled everybody for so many years. Because what she saw was 3 people inside of that gondola. And if you recall, that gondola only ever contained 2 people. It was Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. But now, Ida Ruby is looking up, and clear as day, there are 3 people in that gondola. Even though, at no point was there 3 people. It didn't leave with 3, it didn't come down and take more people on board. It made no sense that there were 3 people inside of that gondola. Again, Ida Ruby wouldn't have known that, but when that information got passed, this was like, how could that be? And so after seeing the 3 men inside of this blimp, Ida lowered her binoculars and watched in horror as this deflated blimp drifted just above her, like practically arm's length above her, and careened over the cliffs behind her and smashed into the ground. And then seconds later, Ida began hearing sirens going off in Daly City, which was located right behind her. That was the nearest town. And so as the blimp came in for a crash landing in Daly City, it scraped across a couple of residential rooftops and hit a couple power lines before kind of coming to a stop in the middle of the street. Now, the blimp didn't explode or catch on fire or anything. It just kind of crumpled to the ground and nobody got out of it. It just kind of stopped and it was there right in the middle of the street. And very quickly, first responders rushed to this blimp because there have been so many reports of this deflated blimp looking like it was about to crash. And so they had been tracking it, and here it was. And so they ran up to this blimp. But at some point, one of the first responders ran up to the gondola itself where the door was slightly open, and they opened it up, hoping to find there would be some survivors inside. But when he looked inside of this relatively small space, there was nobody in there. And there was no sign that anybody had been in there. There was no blood or anything. It was just an empty gondola. But remember, minutes before, not even, Ida Ruby had clearly seen 3 people inside of that gondola. So to go from 3 people to none in the space of a couple hundred feet as everybody's watching this thing come into crash land in Daly City, where could they have gone? And even weirder was when they looked inside of the gondola, they discovered that basically everything was functioning perfectly fine. It was unclear how it became deflated because, again, all the controls inside of this thing were working just fine. And also, the parachutes were still inside of this gondola. If you're going to jump out, you need a parachute, but they were in here. And also the life raft, it was still inside of the gondola. It was like there was nothing wrong with the blimp. And so this whole situation made no sense. The Navy would launch an exhaustive investigation into what happened with this blimp, and the only explanation the Navy came up with was, well, it looks like Officer Adams and Lieutenant Cody just fell out of the blimp at the exact same time and they disappeared into the ocean. However, both pilots were wearing life preservers and would not have taken those off. That was absolutely 101 for being a pilot of one of these blimps. And so they would have had these life preservers on, and even if they had fallen out and perished, they would have floated to the surface, or if they landed on land, they would have likely been found. I mean, the entire route they had been on was heavily scrutinized and searched, but the bodies were never found. And then also, the Navy could not explain how Ida Ruby clearly saw 3 people absolutely 100 feet away from her inside of that gondola. She had no reason to lie about that. She was just saying, yeah, I looked up, saw 3 people, saw it crash into Daly City. She didn't know there was supposed to be 2 people. She was just calling what she saw, but the Navy had no explanation. And so in the years that have followed this empty blimp crash in Daly City, it's been dubbed the ghost blimp story, and loads of theories circulate about what could have happened here. Some people say that, the reason there was all that extra weight at the beginning of the mission profile at 6 a.m. was not because of moisture on the balloon, but because there had to have been maybe a stowaway somewhere in the blimp. And then after takeoff, they jumped down into the gondola, and maybe they were responsible for whatever happened to the pilots and why the blimp crashed. But it doesn't explain what happened to those 3 people. What happened to the stowaway? What happened to Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams' body? We don't know. Other theories include that maybe Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were somehow captured by the Japanese. And some other people say, maybe Cody and Adams were abducted by aliens. But as far-fetched as these theories might seem, the truth is, we really have no idea what happened on that ghost blimp.
In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are 2 people in the front 2 seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these 2 guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these 2 creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually 2 people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was DC Snipers Caught. It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the 2 men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Muhammad and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence. By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming. The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once.
But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively, what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly, it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up, the girl ran inside, and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely, and so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman. But nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys, and so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent, sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix, and so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car, and then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened, the woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard, but that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died.
A man in his 40s was sitting in a cafe, munching on a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. Now, usually, the man had more lavish lunches, but today he was in a hurry to get back to work, and this was all the cafe offered. But then, the most wonderful smell filled the air. The man inhaled deeply, enjoying the heavenly aroma of whatever this food was. It smelled like this incredible hot dish. He looked around to see which table the smell was coming from, but as he scanned the restaurant, all he saw were other patrons eating basically simple sandwiches just like him. And then he remembered this cafe didn't even serve hot meals. But at the same time, he realized he knew that scent from his childhood. It was the smell of the delicious Spanish fried eggs that his mother used to make, called huevos rotos. This was not the man's first phantom smell. A few weeks ago, his apartment had filled with the amazing aroma of his mother's cooking, completely out of nowhere. But now, in this cafe, just like that time in his apartment, the sweet smell suddenly turned sour. The man could taste something metallic in his mouth, and the foul odor of sour milk lingered in the air, making him gag. And so suddenly, a wave of panic crept over the man. He didn't know why he kept smelling things that weren't there. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, ask the follow button to go on a long hike with you, but before you go, superglue a tiny pebble inside one of their shoes. It's common wisdom that diet and exercise are the best ways to maintain your health. As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But sometimes, no matter how fanatical you are about counting calories and getting daily exercise, there's just nothing you can do to keep certain illnesses at bay. And on this episode, we have two stories about extremely healthy people who find themselves fighting off strange, deadly conditions. The first story is about a marathon runner who suddenly goes through a drastic lifestyle change with no explanation. And the second and final story is about an active older woman who unexpectedly finds herself in the hospital, with doctors struggling to figure out what's wrong with her before it's too late. And now here's our first story called No Reservations. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop, and for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now, being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment, but even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations, and they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry, they'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now. Or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus. Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for 2 conditions, high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. and so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first 2, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection, and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. So he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were a really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life, though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast. This episode is called She Haunts Me. On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter, and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. And it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences, they were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible. Nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick. He was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here. She haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son, and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said. They were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver. and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter, when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena. It's called My Brother's Keeper.
Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer, he was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors, or police officers, or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so, Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed, and then finally at 2 a.m. he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the 2 brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off, but instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them, and when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door, and pretty quickly the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the 2nd floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the 2nd floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the 2nd floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere. And lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open.